Thank you for having us here today. My name is Delisle. I'm the Environmental Projects Coordinator for Education and Outreach at the Kahnawà Environment Protection Office. We have some of our team here today going to be presenting on some of our current projects. We have Marina Gosselin speaking for climate change, Delisle for terrestrial habitats, and Butera for contaminated sites. So we're going to be sharing some of the work that we're doing. And if you have any questions, please save them till afterwards, or you can come chat with us. We're going to be here all weekend set up at the table if you have any questions or want to chat about anything we're sharing today. So first, a little bit of background that might be helpful. If you're not familiar, KEPO is a unit under the Mohawk Council of Kahnawà with the mandate to fight to protect and better the environment. In the past, KEPO had played a larger role in food sovereignty in the community. We were promoting organic gardening. We were managing some community gardens, and we had started the annual Health and Harvest Fair until 2016. At that time, it kind of went under KSDPP, and we moved away from some of this food sovereignty work more. We became more focused on wildlife and habitat studies, restoration work, aquatic monitoring, climate change work, contaminated sites, and environmental education. So we kind of moved away from food sovereignty, but all of our work is still linked to food sovereignty, planting in different ways. But we'd like to know from everybody here today how KEPO could continue in this work, how we should be continuing to help with these projects. I mean, there's a lot of groups in the community doing gardening, doing food sovereignty. We have the KCI team. There's a lot of community gardens. So what should our role be in this type of work in the community? Should we be supporting these? Should we be moving back into this area, creating our own gardens? So something to think about, something we'd like to chat with you about later on maybe. We have at our table, we're open to suggestions from everybody here, what you think we should be responsible for in this area. So something to keep in mind. And I'm going to pass it over to Marina first to talk about climate change, and you'll see through her examples how some of our work is still closely aligned with planting and food sovereignty work, but more on the climate change side. So,
good morning. I'm Marina. I'm here to talk about the light stuff, climate change. So just to start off, I don't know if anyone's seen this document, but basically my work is sort of based off of the Kahnawà Climate Change Plan. This was drafted in 2019 and 2020. So we're just coming up on its 5-year anniversary, so it's due for an update. But basically, the general vision of the climate change plan is to address climate change through adaptation and mitigation actions and planning. So through the development of that plan, KEPO's focus has been on actively protecting the diversity of ecosystems in Kahnawà and the community from the impacts of climate change. So one of the main components of the plan is a list of recommended measures and actions that local organizations and businesses and individuals can take to both mitigate their contribution to climate change and enhance their adaptive capacity to the impacts. So basically this document guides the work and activities that we plan to reduce our contributions to climate change. And the important thing as well is that it does so while being in alignment with Ungwe values. So I don't want to talk too much about the impact or the expected impacts because they're also always changing and well, we hear it on the news every day basically. So, but basically just to say that the specific things that were identified for this region are higher average temperatures, more heat waves, droughts, destructive storms, heavy rainfall, and floods. So, you know, the fun stuff. So the idea is just to be aware of these things and basically work to better prepare the community so that we're more resilient, we know what to expect, and we're prepared for it, basically. Planting activities. So the first one that I did was making satellite images, or using satellite images to kind of map out hot zones in the community, which is like that bottom map there. And as you can see, Kahnawà is quite a bit cooler than all the surrounding areas, but even so, within Kahnawà, you can kind of identify areas that are consistently hotter, and they're generally more developed areas. So that kind of guided our first planting event on where we should plant trees in the community so that we can kind of offset some of the impacts of heat waves. So we focused on planting really leafy trees to kind of help with that phenomena. Other work that we've done workshops. So we did an off-grid solar training this past summer in July. I'm trying to plan a second one because it was quite popular, and I still have a waiting list of people who want to sign up. It's just hard to get that coordinated with the person who presented it. We also did a rain barrel giveaway with the idea to help conserve water, promote the use of rainwater for gardening. That was also really popular. We had all 90 rain barrels reserved in about an hour, so that was quite popular. We've done ecological planting workshops. We have, so many things. We've also worked with a consultant who did an energy audit of the sports complex building, and that was just to sort of analyze how much energy the building was using, which was quite a lot. So that kind of had the benefit of reducing its costs, operational costs, but also reducing greenhouse gas emissions if we're using less energy. A lot of the future work will continue to focus on adaptation, as we are now. And then the hope is to also work with other community organizations to develop adaptation strategies that are more focused for individual groups, and then the kind of work that they do. So, yeah. Another thing that we do is we work on, well, Julie and I, we do a lot of communications with the idea of raising awareness about climate change impacts, specific actions that people or groups can take in the community. Again, a lot of the focus is on adaptation and mitigation. Last year, I also started a climate change guidebook, which is just this one. It's kind of in its first version, but the idea is to expand it. So that basically includes like a little dictionary that we're having translated to Kahnawà, and it basically includes a lot of terms and definitions that are used by scientists in the media, just to make the language more accessible to people who see this every day and don't really know what the heck they're talking about. So just to make that more accessible to people. And then we also communicate on the types of upcoming projects we have. And again, like we had other campaigns where we mentioned individual actions, collective actions. We're also doing our Earth Month campaign in April. The first one was done last year. And last year we had some climate change definitions translated into Kahnawà, and we'll do the same again this year. So, one of the most recent projects that we did was a permaculture workshop in relation to the food forest, which was our last planting activity. So basically, in the lead up to planting the food forest, we wanted to take a different approach to planting, as opposed to just going, well, the site, I'll start with the site. The site was on the island, so everyone who's local knows that the island is very rocky with poor soil quality. So the idea was, in having chosen that site, trying to take a different approach where we don't have to go in with heavy machinery and dig up huge holes just to plant trees. So we decided to take a permaculture approach. I took Graham's permaculture course this past summer. And so that kind of made me rework the whole project. Originally, the plan was to bring a bunch of soil onto site and dig holes, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be so much work. So after I took that course, I was like, okay, scrap that. We're gonna kind of go back to the drawing board and just do it differently. So in that case, we did the permaculture workshop. We took the technique of like what we call a lasagna garden, just because it's made up of, it's like a garden bed made of different layers of materials. And so basically, instead of digging down, we're building up to eventually create a healthier soil. So that's the approach that we took. So we had this workshop a week before the main planting event. The rain scared a lot of our participants away, unfortunately. But the ones who were there, they came to the official planting as well. So it was really good to have volunteers who knew what they were doing to help out with that. So basically, it was like a 4-hour permaculture workshop that showed us how to build up these layers, how to plant the tree and then build up around it. So basically, the approach was to focus on soil health as we built up the soil. And the idea of taking a permaculture approach was that it kind of aligned closer to traditional ways, in the sense that the planning of the garden was much more based on design, the design of the garden was based on observation of the land, of the water, the direction of where's the sun in the winter, the wind, and just to think about all of these things and how they would affect the things that we're planting. As well, analyzing the site. And I went with Stephen one day, and we just sat on the site and just looked around us and just to see what was actually growing there, so that we're not bringing a bunch of things that we're not sure if they're going to survive. So that was also really helpful in just understanding the ecosystem that we were planting in. So yeah, so basically this lasagna garden technique was applied in the food forest. I just threw a little diagram up there, which is really hard to read probably, but it just shows like how typically you would build up this layered garden bed. You would typically have like the soil, then you would put wet cardboard. You could have leaves. In this case, we had leaves because it was fall when we planted, so we had an abundance of leaves collected from people's lawns. We also had grass that was from Julie's pollinator garden, so we used that. So basically, it's everything that you would consider like a waste material, but we used it to build up that soil. We were also very fortunate to get a lot of support from the waste management unit, who gave us compost. They brought in the leaves, they brought in mulch, so it was a community project, really. So yeah, so that's kind of the lead up to the food forest. And so maybe I'll just start into like what a food forest is, in case someone is not too sure. But basically, a food forest is a garden that tries to mimic the ecosystem and patterns of a forest, but with plants that would be edible or medicinal. So unlike most gardens that we see or we have at home, the food forest is a bit more three-dimensional in this design, as the plants and trees tend to extend in all directions. So they grow up, they grow to the side, they grow down as well. And a typical food forest would have about 7 different layers, if you will. There's the overstory, so the tall canopy trees, the understory, there's the shrub layer, there's a herbaceous layer, the roots, there's ground cover, and then vines. And in some cases, they also consider like mycelial or like the fungus as part of that. We did include mushrooms in ours too, so we'll consider them. So using these layers, we can fit more plants in an area without causing failure due to competition. So in our case, we incorporated fruit trees, nut trees, herbs, vines, perennials, so that they can be used by people, by the community, which is essentially the goal of this project. So a lot of the focus as well was planting native species that were perennial. So one of the aims of the food forest is also to both mitigate and adapt to climate change, act as a food source, a place to gather medicine, and be a place that community members can just go and enjoy and collect fruit when eventually it's ready. Part of the reasoning for doing a food forest was just something that was highlighted to us in the climate change plan, where a lot of community members expressed concern about food security, food sovereignty. So we wanted to create that additional space, even if it's small. It's, you know, it's a little place that people can go and collect fruit and food. So yes, that project tried to address multiple concerns. And then with the idea that in the future, with fruit trees, with medicines, that we can also collect seeds from these and hopefully exchange. So yeah, one of the big goals of this was just to make it a community space, and that hopefully people will go and participate in its care, in its expansion. And then once the food forest is established, because we just planted this past fall, so obviously we're not going to have fruit and nuts for probably a few years, realistically, which is probably why I don't have a beautiful photo of it yet. Just because, yeah, we planted in the fall, so as you can see, it looks a little bit barren, but, well, it won't look like that forever. So another major component of the project itself was just getting feedback from community members. So we put out a survey, which had quite a good response. So a lot of people told us the kind of things that they wanted to see planted there. Even just, we attended community events like the community barbecue or the strawberry festival, and people were really positive, really happy to see this project. And they would tell us, you know, the kinds of things that used to grow around the community, where they would go, what kind of things they would collect. So just all of this is really important information for us, and kind of maybe gives us a road to eventually expand the food forest and the kind of things that we could include in them. The selection of plants for the food forest was also quite strategic, in the sense that we had to consider the roles and like the functions, the structures of the plants, to sort of build what we call like a tree guild. So we would have a fruit tree or a nut tree, and then we would plant around it basically support species, things that would have different roles to kind of help the tree. So basically, we looked at plants that would suppress the growth of weeds or invasive species, things that would attract pollinators. There were things that would repel pests. So for example, things that would repel would be things like wild onion or wild ginger. We had to have plants that would fix nitrogen to ensure that there was soil health. So things like clover, lupine, groundnuts, which we couldn't get groundnuts this year, but well. So these types of things would help fix nitrogen. We also had to plant things that would provide mulch so that we could basically chop it and leave it, and that would also contribute to enriching the soil that we're trying to build. And then accumulators, so more deep-rooted plants that would gather nutrients for the root layer. And then the plants were also chosen for their structural role. So if it was a ground cover, if it was herbaceous, if it was a vine or a shrub, if it had shallow roots or deep roots, so things that would help us with water retention or, so yeah, these. And then Yeah, all the plants, nearly all the plants were native plants for this area. The difficult part was more like focusing on the trees. So in the end, we ended up planting 6 apple trees of the Empire and Freedom variety. We planted 3 shagbark hickories, 5 black walnut, 3 wild plum, and then on the day of the planting, we had community members bring us pawpaw. So we planted 3 pawpaw trees. So hopefully they take, but it'll probably be years before we see any pawpaws, or apples, or walnuts. Another thing that we had to do on the site was remove buckthorn, which is invasive. But considering that buckthorn is also a popular source of food for birds late in the season, we sort of didn't want to starve the birds either. So we planted things that would, like other berry bushes that would also provide that food source for them throughout the season, so that we're not taking away from them either. Another thing that we did was create mini habitats at each site for the trees. Basically, the rocks that we removed, we made little piles, and that will be home for snakes, which will help us also with pest management, as they'll eat slugs and other pests. So, yeah, I think I might have covered everything. So, yeah, we're also hoping to use this space over time as an educational space. We hope to bring school groups, or just people, so that they can see how we do it. They can learn about plants. They can learn about this technique that we used. And so the next things that we're going to be doing with the food forest will be, well, first we have to put labels so that people know what we've planted. The idea is to also put the names in Kahnawà. As well, we want to, hopefully with time, expand it. So this past fall, after the food forest planting, we also prepped 7 garden beds. So there'll be 7 garden beds ready for further planting of trees in the fall when the trees are dormant. So that's kind of the next step. And then, of course, just maintenance to make sure that the trees survive, if there's a really hot summer. So obviously there'll just be some maintenance and upkeep to do, but the idea with this is that food forest is also a low maintenance style of garden, that probably the first few years you have to put in like the effort to maintain it and care for it, but the idea is eventually, once the trees are well established, that it's a fairly low maintenance process. Yeah, so the main sort of challenges we had with the site was the availability of trees when we were ordering them during the summer. There were a lot of varieties that weren't available. Also the difficulty of the site in terms of its soil quality, the invasive species, basically thinking of how we're replacing plants if we're removing some others. I think I've talked long enough. But if you have any questions about any of the projects that I've presented, please let me know. Yeah, we have a booth over there, so we'll be here for a while. So yeah, I think Cole is up next to talk about invasive species, another light topic. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about invasive species in our seed saving programs. Invasive species, just to lead into it, is really linked with climate change. Invasive species have always been a threat to our native species in the community since they've been introduced and destroying their habitat. But as climate change accelerates and change the habitats further, it's going to be increasing the stresses on the native species and making more room for invasives. So this map here just shows the projected change in the number of invasive species, and in the red is where it's going to be accelerating the most. Canada is going to be seeing the highest impacts in the coming years due to climate change and invasive species. So right now, a number of species are sort of limited by their range of temperature they can survive, but as things warm, they'll be able to move further north. Tree of heaven is an invasive in the United States that's been widespread for years from China. And they've started getting detections of it in BC now. It's moving towards Ontario. There's been a few in Niagara region. And so as it changes, we're also going to be having more extreme weather events. And that's going to be putting stresses on our native species. If there's a drought, if there's a flood, and we have a die-off, that's going to make an area where more invasives can really come in and colonize and take over the area. Some invasives could even contribute to climate change. Emerald ash borer or mountain pine beetle can kill off huge forests, which would normally be a carbon sink, helping in the atmosphere. But as they die, they'll be releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. So Canada would, if large areas of forest are actually removed, rather than being a whole area where we're actually removing carbon, could actually be releasing more carbon than it's absorbing. Kahnawà has been heavily impacted by invasive species. This map here is just something we came up with based on our own knowledge and some of our surveys of invasive species on Kahnawà Island. Invasive species are colonized disturbed areas easier. So the island, since it was created, didn't have any native species on it, so it was very easy for these species to come in and just take over. So if you look on the map, all the blue there is buckthorn, which is in every forest in the community, but it's especially prevalent on the island. We also have phragmites, white sweet clover, white poplar, spotted napkin. So to manage the invasive species here, we've been sort of been taking this approach of a priority to protect areas which are more sensitive. So for on the island, we've been doing removals on the natural remnant of the old islands and at the restored areas. So taking out phragmites or anything that starts to colonize there, and leaving the areas or trying to just limit the spread where they are currently, because it requires a lot of sort of manpower and manual work to remove that much buckthorn. Invasive species are sort of prevalent throughout the community wherever there's disturbance, either from road construction or if ATVs are moving through an area and drives through some phragmites, they'll spread it to a newer area and take over a wetland. So one of the species our office has been dealing with for years is the emerald ash borer. I think most people should be a bit familiar with it, but the emerald ash borer was brought over from Asia years ago and infects ash trees. The larva will feed on the tree and kill it, preventing the nutrients from going to the top of the tree. So we first detected the emerald ash borer in the community in 2016. We had set traps throughout the community and captured some of the insects. So the first area where we got a lot of hits was around the new developments, the Lot 106 area. We had a huge amount of emerald ash borer detected there. And then since that point, it spread throughout the community. I don't think there's a single ash tree in the community which hasn't been infected with the or already killed. So you could just drive along town, you could just look up at the canopy, and if you see a dead tree, it's probably an ash. So we had come up with a black ash management plan, and we did an ash inventory in 2018. So that ash inventory was focused on black ash, and we had found we had about 3,000 black ash in the community, which we've been putting a lot of effort on preserving just because it's more of a threatened species. But we also have a ton of red ash, like over 100,000 red ash in the community. So it's really been changing the forest landscape. Like I said, once these trees die, invasive species could move in and take over from them. So some of the items we've been doing are treating ash trees. We have some ash trees in local parks or in the big fence, and we've just been treating about 70 of these trees with triazine. It's a neem-based natural pesticide. We inject it every year. It protects it for 2 years. But it's really expensive to do every year. So we've had to limit that, and we're just preserving these trees so we can either collect the seeds from them, or if to keep basket making going. For the future, we could cut these trees and use that as a basket making tree. Yeah, and so since 2019, we've also been saving seeds. So we've made some partnerships with the National Tree Seed Center in Fredericton. Their director, Donnie McPhee, has come to the community a couple times and trained our staff in collecting seeds. So we've been going out, especially 2019 was a really good year for black ash. They were a great crop, so we collected a lot of seed, and we've sent it to the National Tree Seed Center to store. And so they'll be storing that for us until we can eventually replant once the emerald ash borer is gone. So keeping the black ash and emerald ash borer in mind, I'm just going to be talking about a couple of other invasives that are coming up. Oak wilt. Oak wilt is a species which has been in the US for years. It was first detected in the 1940s, I think. It's a fungus which affects any kind of oak trees. It will cause these sort of splits in the bark, and you'll be able to see fungus, but it's known for the wilting, rusty color. It'll come on the leaves, and it will kill an oak within a year. So this really moves really slowly since it's been in the U.S. since the 40s, but it's only getting here this year. I think it was this year, May, it was detected in Niagara. So it was originally spread by the railroad industry when they were cutting and destroying forests, and they were using the oaks as for the railroad. It spread it throughout the U.S. and it's been devastating there. So the only really treatments for oak would be complete removal of the tree. That would be removing the branches, removing the roots, and completely removing it from the area, or a fungicide, which is really not really practical. It's spread by the beetle, which will live its life cycle on the oak. It'll get the fungus on its feet, and it'll spread it to another oak tree. So this is one of the invasives which are really high on the watch list right now, just because of the impacts it could have. Because when emerald ash borer killed all the ash trees, a lot of people replanted with oaks. It was the same thing with Dutch elm disease. Everyone replanted ash when the elms started dying. So it just shows the importance of diversifying the tree species we're planting. The next invasive is spotted lanternfly. So spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper. It will feed on a number of different trees, but it's linked to the tree of heaven, the invasive I talked about before. So it will live its life cycle on the tree of heaven, laying its eggs on it and feeding on it and killing it or weakening it. But the nymphs will also feed on other things. So willows, maples, oaks, apples, grapes, and it will kill off from overfeeding on these species. So in Pennsylvania, in 2023, they had $4.26 million of damage to the agricultural industry just from this insect. It wasn't detected in Canada yet, but they were detected in Buffalo, New York, so they're going to be here soon. So this could have really hard impacts for the maple industry. Maple industry has already been having some problems, but if this insect comes in and threatens a bunch of trees, it'll make it worse. So there are some natural sort of control methods to it. You could remove the tree of heaven. They really use that as their host. So if there's trees of heaven around, remove those. You could remove the egg mats directly from the trees, or put adhesive bands on it, which will catch the insects as they go up it, or of course pesticides, but that's not the preferred method for us. So some of the things we've been doing in response, as I mentioned, the National Tree Seed Center. We've been working with them for a number of years now for our ash seed projects, and in 2019 and 2022, we've sent staff there to train in seed storage. So they trained us for collecting the seed from the trees, bringing it in, processing to remove a lot of excess material, freezing it, and doing germination tests on them. So we've been using sort of their same method for our field collections on data collection and database, and yeah. So they have actually a large collection of our seeds that we've done for a number of years now, and they've been a really great resource for us. We've also started our own seed vault. So last year, 2022, we got some funding to establish a small seed vault. So we purchased a lot of processing materials that the National Tree Center would use, and we've been making collections. So this just shows some of the red ash seed we collected that year. And one of our bags actually, so this would be all the information we collect, the location, whether it was from a single tree or not, just to keep that sort of chain of custody going throughout the collections. So the seed vault is being established to preserve species at risk or species that might become at risk. So we've been focusing on black ash, but if another invasive comes through and different species start to become threatened by either climate change or this invasive, we can have this sort of backup of seeds that sort of has the unique genetic diversity that our community has. This will also help us in the future for restoration projects. It's projected that there's going to be a seed shortage, a seed supply shortage in Canada due to a lot of initiatives like 2 billion trees that are planting throughout the world, and the supply is not going to keep up. So this will make sure we have some seed for our projects. And finally, well, not all is lost for all these trees. For the ash, some species, well, some ash actually show a genetic resistance to emerald ash borer. They call this lingering ash, and it's something that there's been a lot of research on. So a small percentage of all the ash trees will show this resilience and survive. So in the next few years, we're going to be focusing on finding these trees, collecting from them, and establishing some monitoring plots so we can propagate this resilience. We're also looking at doing the same for butternut, since our butternut trees got hit really hard in the past. So hopefully we get some funding for that. We're also going to be working on a project to manage the buckthorn in Big Fence, and we're going to be working on another black ash inventory to see what the impacts have been since our last one. And I think that's it for me.
Pollinator protection projects. Only talking a little bit about scary invasive species. So we've done some of these projects to help declining pollinator populations. Pollinators are on a steep decline due to things like climate change, habitat loss is a leading cause. So some of these projects were to really bring back some of that habitat in spaces in the community. The first one being the pollinator garden that was established on the island in 2015. They had started a 440 square meter pollinator garden right next to where the food forest is. We have an educational monarch butterfly sign there if you're back, with the help of community members as well, volunteers at the time. And they had a seed mixture that was used. And when they first planted this garden, they had brought soil onto the island because, as we heard, the soil on the island isn't great, very rocky, so soil was brought in to plant this original garden. And then they expanded the garden in 2017 to the larger area. You kind of see like it's a little bit lighter green. It had been expanded then. And then over time, there was a lot of challenges to maintain this garden. Like we've heard, invasive species kind of take over the space on the island because it's an artificial habitat, rocky soil. Invasives can really spread easily. They spread quickly, and they outgrow all the native species that we have on the island. So since it had been expanded, there wasn't enough staff really to maintain this site, to properly remove all the invasives every year, to dedicate to keeping this site up. So in 2022, we really tried to target our efforts onto this garden and try and bring it back to life, kind of. So that was a lot of
pulling invasives out, cutting the grasses, just being out there, I mean, a couple times a week during the growing season with summer students, and it was a lot of work. But last year we've seen the efforts pay off from that. This was early in the season in June of last year. You can see it's kind of looking like a little brown, some of the areas where we just had to cut the grass back. That was a little bit dried out. But then the end of the season, you see a lot of the life that came back to the garden. We didn't target the entire space in that first year. We just did the original space of the garden. And you can see just from doing that how green it is and lush in the after. And we saw a lot of those native plants that we had originally planted come back there. There's a lot of different flowers that are growing there. We've seen some of the milkweed come back, a lot of pollinators returning to this area. So it's showing that if we put in the time and effort, just non-stop, pulling weeds, cutting grasses. We have the invasive species that we have in this area are spotted knapweed, we have the sweet white clover, wild parsnip. So it's been tricky to manage, but this is a lot of with the help of summer students to get this work done. You can see here, we tried to tarp some of the area. At the beginning of the season last year, we removed the tarp. At the end of the season, we put new soil down. It had been a really rocky area towards the back of the garden. I think it was part of like a four-wheeler trail at one point. So we covered that now with new soil after tarping to kill the invasives. We put a seed mixture down, and we're going to be adding some seedlings in the springtime. So we're going to see how that works in that one small area to start, and then hopefully move that to the larger area of the garden and see how that goes. Yeah, but overall, it's really a much-needed habitat on the island for pollinators because of the low diversity that we used to have in that space. And you can see here just how much grasses and invasives are growing. We really had to like kind of dig out some of like the small native plants that were hiding underneath there. They weren't getting sunlight, they weren't growing, they didn't have any space. So it's really an effort, but we're seeing that if we put in the time, things will return. And then hopefully being able to add more seedlings to the entire space this year. So we are always looking for volunteers who want to help out with that and pull some invasives. So another project we've been doing since 2021 is the No Mow May campaign challenge. So what it is that we ask community members to refrain from mowing their yards for the entire month of May to support pollinator plants growing. People are registered to participate. They receive one of these little lawn signs to show that they're participating. They don't mow their lawns. They send us progress pictures every week to show us that they're still participating, to show us what's growing there. And we share those to our social media to encourage others to participate and show the pollinators that are returning. And then they're entered to win a nice prize at the end of the month if they stick with the challenge all month. So this idea of No Mow May actually started in the UK, and it's intended to give insects and their food supplies a chance to go through their life cycle early in their life cycle, and it'll help them out throughout the rest of the season, the rest of the summer. So this is, I mean, it's a really simple action that people can take to help. I mean, it's asking people to do nothing basically, like don't touch your yard, don't mow. And for us, it's more of a way to raise awareness about pollinators, how to help pollinators, and it's to create a conversation where we're shifting the idea of what our properties, what our lawns should look like. We don't have to have these perfectly manicured monoculture golf courses in our front yards always, because really we need to help our biodiversity and our pollinators any way we can. So, of course, you see the dandelions come up right away. And those are great, those are all helpful for pollinators, but people have been noticing other things growing there when they leave it alone, and they send us pictures of like, I've never noticed that flower there, I've never seen this plant in my yard, but because you're mowing it so early, you don't see these things that could be in our spaces. We need to create more biodiversity, and you can do it just in your front yard by doing nothing. But to go further, we do suggest that people maybe think of creating a permanent space on their property, permanent little pollinator gardens, doing some small changes that would benefit wildlife pollinators throughout the summer. So the challenge is really more of a starting point for what we could do. So if you're interested, in April we're going to be promoting this more, opening up sign-ups. I think we're going to have maybe about 30 signs for your lawn. If you're interested, sign up. First one, you'll get a sign, and you can participate in this without signing up with us, but you get a nice prize maybe at the end of the month if you do. So pollinator pathways. So this is something, a new project that we had started last year. We wanted to create 2 pollinator gardens in the community and get the youth involved in this type of work. So we had funding from Green Communities Canada, their Living Cities Fund, and we worked with the Kahnawà Education Center to get these created. So we chose sites in the community that were close to the elementary schools. One site is at Marina School. It's right by their fence, like you see it kind of by like where you would exit. We planted a garden there. And then the other one is at the Golden Age Club. They have a green space there where we were able to put a garden. And we chose that site because it was close enough to Kahnawà School where the students can come out there and help with the planting and then the maintenance later on. And it was challenging to find places in the community for these gardens. There's not a lot of common land green space where we could just put a garden where we could keep something growing. So it was great to have the schools on board helping with this, the lands unit as well, helping with site selection. So in the fall of last year, we planted a seed mixture with the students. We worked with the consultant, Annie Martin, from Ecological Landscapes to choose the seed mixture and to choose the sites for the planting as well. We worked with Alison Lorimer for landscaping on this. We worked with KSCS when we did the planting. We had B. Taylor come and present her knowledge on traditional seed keeping, and she shared seed songs with the students. And so we put down our seeds first, and then in the spring we hope to be able to add seedlings into these gardens as well. We still have funding to be able to purchase seedlings and get maybe some more classes involved, bring back the same students that had originally planted. We were also able to give rain barrels to the schools if they want to maintain help to water the gardens. The students can get involved with doing that throughout the season as well. So it's a really good way to just share with the students how to plant, about pollinators, why we need pollinators and biodiversity. It's a good way to collaborate with other organizations and groups in the community. And it's going to be educational for the community as well. We're going to be installing signs that explain what the purpose of the garden is, why it's here, and then hopefully be able to do this in other sites in the community with youth. Some of the challenges that we might face is finding the available sites to do this. Like I mentioned, not a ton of common land green space that we could just throw a garden on, but there could be. We could try and work on prioritizing some of our spaces in the community to be beneficial for biodiversity, set aside for the environment. And then maintenance of these sites could be a challenge. Like I mentioned, it was only our first year, so we're going to be seeing how that's going to be working with the schools to maintain these areas. KEPO is going to be responsible for watering and weeding these gardens in the first few years until they're established. So hopefully we have some more help, some more volunteers if we want to do these in other areas to help with the maintenance of these sites. And I believe that's all. Yeah. So that's just an example of some of our pollinator projects, but like I mentioned, hopefully we can do some more with help from other groups in the community. I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie.
Hi everybody. I'm going to finish off our presentation just talking about some soil management. So really that's the base of any agricultural project. If you want to be producing healthy plants, you really want to start with healthy soil. So when we talk about healthy soil, we're talking about soil fertility. And soil fertility refers to the soil's ability to sustain plant growth. So here, we're talking about plants growing big as well, but also more nutritious. So the healthier soil you have, the healthier plants you're going to have. You're going to have better health for your body. And also it can affect the taste. So if you grow the same plant in a healthier soil and a less healthy soil, you're going to see even differences in taste. So fertile soils, they have to have essential nutrients and water, of course. Also the absence of toxic chemicals. So toxic chemicals will of course affect the plant's ability to grow, but also you have to think about what you're putting into your body. So if you're growing plants in toxic soil, they're going to take up those toxins and you're going to end up eating them. And then you can have bioaccumulation where it's going also into the animals. So even if it's not a species that we eat, the animals can eat it, and then if you hunt those animals and you eat them, you're taking that into your body. You also need sufficient soil depth for the roots to grow. So this would be based on the plants that you want to grow. Some might need shallower soil and some might need deeper soil. Sufficient drainage. So also you wouldn't want to be growing plants in sand because that will allow the water to move too quickly. But you also don't want a clay that's too dense and doesn't allow the water to move through because then you can have your roots drowning. You want a neutral pH, so between 5.5 and 7. If it's too acidic, it can kill the plants, but also if it's too basic. And the presence of microorganisms that support plant growth. So often there's symbiotic relationships between the plants and bacteria or fungi that help them grow and help replenish nutrients in the soil. So I wanted to talk a little bit about traditional soil management. So we're all familiar with like Western agriculture, monocultures, and this type of plant growth is not really sustainable. So it really depends on a lot of chemical inputs. So if you go and you buy strawberries, for example, from the supermarket, they look big and red, but you bite into them and they don't really taste like much. And that goes back to the soil fertility. If you continue to grow just one plant over a big area, the soil is not really fertile. You're not really replenishing the nutrients. You're putting in a lot of chemical nutrients. You'll have a lot of problems with pests as well, which leads to a lot of pesticide use. And those pesticides often get into the soil and they remain there for many, many years. So we can go back to traditional techniques. These are techniques that have been passed down through generations, but they're based on a lot of observation and intimate knowledge of both the land and the plant species that you want to grow. So it really shouldn't be discounted as some type of non-science because it really is scientific in the end. So some cultures have looked at color changes of topsoil. So that can tell you the nutritional health or how much water it will have in it. There's the Fulani people, they're from sub-Saharan Africa, so they were semi-nomadic people. So they would move around and they would settle for a while and grow. So they used to talk about hot and cold soils. And basically that would mean the water retention. So hot soils, if you touch it, they feel hot because they're dry. And the water would move through them more quickly. But colder soils would retain water better. So this was a way that they would tell whether the soil was good for planting or not. So even if they're using different language, it doesn't mean that they're not able to scientifically prove their ideas. Also timing, so many cultures have used moon, like lunar calendars, also the stars. So if you go down further south, the stars that you see in the sky are different at different times of the year. So that can tell you when you need to put manure, when you need to plant, when you need to harvest, all based on natural cues. Also animal migration, so some people have used the leaving or the coming of birds to signal when they need to plant or when they need to harvest. And then there's seasons. So seasons are temperature, but mostly, especially here in the north, it will be day length. So a lot of plants depend on the length of light that they get during the day, not so much the temperature. So understanding these things can really tell you when is the best time to plant to get the best harvest. Crop rotation is another idea of how you plant. So you'll have different fields, and you can leave fields fallow. So often soils need a little bit of time to rest and just replenish through bacteria and fungi and decomposition. Also, you can plant different species after each other. So for example, soybeans, they fix nitrogen. So you can plant them first, and then once you harvest them, you plant another crop, which then benefits from the nitrogen that was replenished in the soil. You can also do this through intercropping. So this is when you plant different species together. So soybeans and corn are a good example of that, because the soybeans will put the nitrogen in the soil and the corn will grow better. Also, you could do spinach and strawberries, or different kinds of beans are also good, like soybeans. Trying to think of more examples of intercropping. In the south, they like to plant coffee with bananas. And going back to Marina's idea of having different levels in your garden, so some plants prefer shade, so you can plant a fruit tree and then plant other bushes underneath those trees, and then you're managing your space, but also you're thinking about what different plants need and how they would best grow. And then you can use natural inputs such as manure and compost to avoid using chemical inputs. So you really don't need to use these chemical fertilizers when you can understand the science of the plants and what they need. And finally, I wanted to talk a bit about contaminated soil remediation. So when you have a contaminated site, it's often contaminated with toxic chemicals that have been put there through human use. So the first step that you need to take is really to characterize the site. So you need to understand what toxins are present, in what amount. You have to know where they are. So is it just in the soil? Is it in the water? You need to understand how they move. So certain toxins will like to stick to the soil, but others like water better, and those ones will travel farther and faster. So you need to really do a deep characterization and understand what's there, and that's often very time-consuming and costly. So then when you have a large contamination source, the first thing you would want to do is contain that and remove it. But of course you have to keep in mind that that's kind of just moving the problem. So often these chemicals will then end up in landfills, or you're just giving your problem to somebody else. Some techniques that people are investigating now is phytoremediation. So this is using plant species to decontaminate soils and water. This is dependent on the chemicals that are present and the species of plants. So certain plants, they can take up the chemicals through their root system and into their plant matter. And then you have to go in, you have to harvest it and often burn the plant matter. You can't eat it. And also you have to try to manage other animal species as well, because they can come in and eat these contaminated plants. Other species will actually break down the chemicals. So that's good. They have certain chemicals that they will release to neutralize the chemicals, and others can stabilize it. So they will hold it in their root system or their rhizomes. So it doesn't take away the problem, but at least it doesn't allow it to affect other areas. There's also biological treatments. So you can use certain bacteria, fungi, that will neutralize the chemicals as well. They can break them down or change them to something that isn't harmful. Or chemical treatments, which again, you're adding chemicals to neutralize chemicals, but you always have to try and think of secondary effects. So really the best way to control contamination is to think about what you're using and try to not contaminate in the first place. So, you know, reduce your garbage consumption, try to think about reusing things, and know that what you put out into the earth can take a very, very long time to break down. Of course, nature, if left alone, will be able to break down these things over time, but it can take many, many, many years and cause a lot of damage in the meantime. So really the best way is just avoiding using these chemicals and really trying to work with nature and understand how things work. So, Nyao, Boa, for your interest in all of our projects. Now I want to turn it over to you all. If you have any questions or comments, you can ask now. I think we have a few minutes. Yeah.
I would like maybe next time you would include some photographs of the invasive species. You talk about them, but a lot of us are not familiar what they look like. So that, I think that would be very helpful. That's one thing that I noticed.
The invasive plants.
Yeah. Okay. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, and also the invasive plants, the reason why they spread so much is often they're more resilient. So if you have, like, for example, on the island, where the soil is really not fertile, it's hard for the good native species that we want to populate, but these resilient invasives just spread like wildfire.
We do have also on our social media and on our website, we could share with you some of the invasive species. We have photos at different areas, and we have profiles on our social media of some of these different invasives that we mentioned and the different control methods that you can try and use.
No.
For your seed mixture that you use for the pollinated plants and gardens, are those available? Like, is that mixture like something that obviously is good to use anywhere?
We ordered the seed mixture from a company, Rustic Nursery, and it was a seed mixture for full sun areas, dry soil, but they have different options available. We would recommend them because it's organic nursery, no pesticides. I have the list of plants and seeds that were used in that garden available. I have a list of them here. If you're interested, I can give you that and share who we had ordered from. And I wanted to mention too, we also have wildflower seeds that we're giving away and blueberry seeds at our table if anybody's interested.
When trying to control invasive species, how would you dispose of them after you've like weeded and that stuff? What's the best way to do that?
Depends on the species. Some of them, if you could dry them out before doing it, so that's what we've done for Phragmites on the island. We'll collect them and we'll dry them under a tarp for a few weeks to just make sure everything's dead, and then we'll burn it. Some places will accept it in the compost. They don't accept it in town, right, Holly? Yeah, but if you have your own compost, you can do it in the backyard for some species. It really depends on each individual one. So if you look at Ontario has really good best management plans. If you just go Ontario best management plans, you can see for each species what's the best disposal method.
How much does international seaway trapping affect the impact of invasive species? Would you say that's the majority of the problem?
I'm actually not sure. Wish Tyler was here. Yeah, we do have like an aquatics team who specializes more in the aquatic invasive species. They have a better idea. Just from our conversations with Transport Canada and the Seaway Authority, it seems like there's fairly good methods, at least for ships coming in from international ports for managing ballast water and things. But I guess the question would be if things are moving from the Great Lakes down to our area just within the country itself, because I don't know what the regulations are like for that.
You mentioned earlier on in the beginning, how do we bring your activities together with Food Sovereignty Group? You have to remember that we didn't go
gardens. We grew gardens, but a lot of our food and medicine and nutrients came from the forest. So we remember how we used all those plants that you were growing, and then that's our food and medicine also. But when we start allowing those things to grow, you gotta know that you have to leave space for them, so it brings back people's memory of, you know, making sure that we have green space in our life and for our future. So when you start protecting the habitat where your ginseng grows, or where your bloodroot, or your, you know, anything that you want, your trouble, once you start protecting this habitat, because you want to use that medicine or that food, and then it just carries on to our younger generation. So doing what you're doing is actually food sovereignty and sharing ourselves, because that's what it's all about right now.
Yeah, it could be just keeping the habitats healthy too for the wildlife. Keeping the waters healthy for the fish that will harvest.
So we're wildlife. Yeah, so we gotta remember that everybody is wildlife. Yeah, we're all wildlife. Especially
How much research did you do in consideration of the food forest and companion planting? I'm experiencing a lot of interest among us there about food forests, but a lot of our youth and general community members have this idea that they're going to create a food forest and then walk away and it's going to be magically an utopia. But I said that's not so. Like your food trees need pruning, your berries need pruning, anything else they may need to cut back, or fertilize, or maybe water. What have you experienced in your research?
So a lot of the research was also just taking the permaculture course so that I can learn not just about plants themselves, but just the types of things that we could plant that we know would survive, but also thinking about it long term. So the things that we planted, sometimes we know that we're not going to continue with them. They're kind of like our sacrificial species, if you will, in the sense that we know that they're going to serve their purpose, but they're going to make way, or they're going to improve conditions for other plants in the future that we'll plant. So right now, just assuming that our soil quality is not really great, we're also thinking long-term, and not just right now and having this like utopia, like you mentioned. We know it's a long-term vision to get there. In terms of like research, yeah, it was, of course, I had to read up about a lot of plants, their different roles. You know, if it's a plant that would help us fix nitrogen. I mean, some plants obviously have multiple functions. It's not just like they attract pollen. No, they also repel pests. So it was just learning those functions, kind of learning the different structures of a food forest, or even a forest in general, right? Because a forest is composed of many layers of so many different species. And so trying to sort of replicate that in one space was also a challenge. As well, this is my first food forest, so.
Did you find any relationship with companion planting, with trees, plants?
Yeah, so.
Insects, animals?
Yeah, definitely. So the idea is to let nature in as well, right? You don't want to just make it a place where it's like, oh no, we don't want birds, we don't want insects to eat the berries, or no, we also want them because they do serve a purpose in that space. So, you know, just building little snake habitats. We know the snakes will help us with slugs, and you know, so it's, I feel like I've talked about this for so long, it's such a big topic. But yeah, it basically, my research just tried to focus on the roles of all these plants and ecosystems, and trying to make an ecosystem, which is not to say that there wasn't one in place, but with all the invasive species we had to manage, it was basically sometimes when we have invasive species, they're playing a role too, right? Some invasive species grow and they're fixing nitrogen, or they're growing in conditions that maybe native plants wouldn't do very well in. So it's kind of thinking, what is that invasive species doing in that place, and what can we replace it with that would also kind of maintain that function, but trying to plant something that's suited to the area that was always there. So I don't know if I'm answering very directly your question, but I feel like I can talk about this like all day. Who's next?
I was just saying, it's quite a forest to go walk away because if you're there, you're constantly using it.
That's the message that we have to get out to the community. That's why I wanted to apply that it's not just a magical garden. We don't have to care for it.
Yeah.
And we have our community, especially young people, understand that.
Yeah.
It's no, I've had bad raspberries and mussels on the street, I'm harvesting the leaves from the feed and I have the berries. Then when I bring them back, I use the cane and the garden and plastic.
And you make that relationship with the birds because you're competing with the harvested berries.
Yeah.
And you know when the birds go, you're going to get up there and start picking.
But one day I did it, I left for the day and I came home and somebody was using my garden. So I came home and my berries are gone, but I seen them that morning. So I was blaming the guy. I said, did you pick all my berries? And he's like, no. And then I'm like, never mind, because I seen a robin sit down and pick the berries. And I'm like, oh, I found the culprit.
A good message is nothing's good in life comes for free. It takes effort and work. The companion planting that you were talking about in the food forest, the plants that were grown around each tree were specific to assist that tree in obtaining the proper growing elements. And yes, some of them are sacrificial. They're not going to stay forever, but they'll be replaced with something else. And the design they have, once the food forest starts to become mature, it's going to support an area where you want to bring a family. The bigger trees will be on the outside, sheltering the prevailing winds, which will also support the smaller trees and the fruit trees for more production. But the major thing to remember, nothing is free. And gardening, there is no better thing than gardening to keep families strong. If you get into garden with your family, you can have strong families. Those children will learn how to cook and eat real food. It's not getting on the phone, okay, we got supper coming.
So many lessons.
Yeah. Exactly. That's why I say gardens are especially
I have questions. One is, I'm trying to build my own food forest, food and medicine, and I'm planting a perennial vegetable garden and stuff like that. But I'm really interested in the plants that are from Kahnawà, that were here naturally. And when you planted on the island, you said something about like 20 different types of medicinal plants.
Yeah, it was a mix. It was like, there were berries, there were shrubs, there were ground covers, so it was 20 varieties of plants that weren't the trees themselves.
Yeah, because I go out and I harvest wild garlic, but I don't take much. I don't want to go up there because you planted plants. Like, did you multiply them first, or like did you set up like a greenhouse where you can care for that plant?
No, we had to order them. I would love to have a greenhouse.
So
I know people can do that.
So there are places where
You can, yes. There are
order wild
trees.
garlic and ginger.
I didn't see wild garlic available, but there are places that focus on the invasive species only. It's a tree nursery, but they also have like smaller plants, ground covers, different medicinal plants. So I can give you the information if you like. But we don't have a greenhouse. We don't really have the space for it or the manpower. But if we did, I'm sure we would
pick them because it seems like all the lands are getting shrunken. Like, it's not like when I was a kid, it was like lots of places we could still plant trees and stuff. Not anymore.
So that's something that we'd also like to start the conversation on. We have Carly Loft here, who is from KEPO as the Environmental Projects Coordinator for Policy and Outreach. And we want to start the conversation on protected areas in the community, what that would look like in the community. So we have these spaces where you know you can go and get medicines, and it's reserved for medicines, it's reserved for hunting, it's reserved for these practices in the community where it won't be developed. So it's something we're starting to look at now, but we want to have those conversations. What could this look like? So we'd love to chat about that later on, but I think that's all the time we have right now for questions, but we'll be over here. Oh, sorry.
The other part of my question, it's actually a footprint, but I would really like to know if you documented everything that you did at the gardens on the island, where we can look at like the stuff that Doug was talking about too. You have the trees and then all the plants around. Have you documented that?
Yeah, so I've mapped it out, and I have diagrams of where everything's been planted, so that we know what's there. Because the idea is to put labels so that people can go and see what's there.
But is there like a source where people in the community who are interested in replicating that in their own spaces?
I don't have that yet, but I would like to share that information. I don't know if like on our KEPO website or what format that's going to take, but yeah, I do want to make that information available if people do want to replicate something somewhere in their own gardens. So that's also part of the job work that needs to be done. I think that's it, right?
But there are things in regards to invasive species and climate change and so on. But one of the big culprits or that happens with people, especially like in Ontario, they banned people from cutting down the milkweed. And so you're not allowed to cut milkweed anywhere in Ontario. But on the other hand, they don't allow Roundup. And Roundup can be found in any store that you can think of. Little tiny store, you walk in the doorway and it's full of Roundup. And this is one of the leading culprits to destroying everything. It goes in the soil, it kills everything. In my garden where I've been planting for the last 40 years, you know, I've been growing many different varieties of squash, and I've never had a vine squash borer ever until the last couple of years. And I was kind of wondering why. And then I realized there are no more purple martins. I see one or two. Before there used to be hundreds or thousands of them flying all over. And if you see how the vine borer moth flies, just like this, martin will grab it in a moment. So there's no more martins, there's no more sparrows, there's no more swallows, there's no more bats. So all of these are part of the ecological balance, so that we also have to become aware of and do what we can.